So let's get started with taking apart this book and trying to understand it a little bit better. So we're going to start with chapter 1, which in the book there's a sort of a preface to that, which explains a little bit about how archaeology is done in different places. Now, I mentioned in the introduction, in my introductory lecture, that I hope you've watched, is that archaeology in North America is a branch, a subdiscipline within the larger body of anthropology. Anthropology comes from the Greek words anthropos and logos, which means the study of humans. Archaeology, means the study of old things. Archaeos just means old stuff. And we're actually going to be looking in a few chapters at some things that might be referred to as paleo, which also means old, paleontology or paleoarchaeology. That also means old, but there's sort of a connotation in ancient Greek of paleo means a little bit older. So archaeologos just means old human stuff, really, things that are contemporary with human cultures. And paleontology or paleoarchaeology means things that are slightly older than that, maybe pre-human. So we will look at some some of the pre-human past and how we came to become human. And so it's important, and I'll just recap again from my introduction, that in North America there are 4 branches of anthropology, which is cultural anthropology, which studies contemporary human cultures. There's linguistic anthropology, which studies communication between forms of communication, language, symbols, writing, even things like art within human groups and their contexts as well. Also, there's physical or biological anthropology, which studies the physicality, the biology of humans. And then there's archaeology, which is the past. There's some talk about a forensic anthropology being a separate subdiscipline, because that involves the use of anthropological information for courtroom situations, which is a specialized subject. Right now, one of those 4 subdisciplines can present information to courts, but they may not know very much about the law as a matter of course. Some do, some don't. So there is a push by some to create a separate subdiscipline, which is forensic anthropology, which is sort of half anthropology, half law. But we really want to talk about archaeology and what it is. And archaeology as a discipline evokes a lot of interest and excitement for people because it's been popularized in media, films, and television, and books, and all sorts of popular renderings of what it is that we do. Now, archaeology is exciting. I don't tend to fight very many Nazis these days, like Indiana Jones does, but it does get you out there traveling the world sometimes if you're interested in foreign archaeology. But it's also localized right here. It's under our feet as we speak. It's right under my feet as I sit here in my office. It's probably under your feet as well, because archaeology is not a time or a place. It isn't even necessarily ancient. Archaeology, archaeologos, old stuff, can be as old as 5 minutes ago. It can be old as 5,000 years ago. It can be old as 500,000 years ago. So archaeology is not really about a specific time, place, human culture from the past. It's a methodology for trying to understand any of those cultures from the past. Now, think about that for a second. How do we do that? That's a big thing, right? How do you create a methodology for understanding the past? If I were to ask you, describe your culture, where would you start? Where would you begin? It's hard. Now, this is something that cultural anthropology, one of the branches of anthropology, actually does. They have a system for trying to gather information from contemporary cultures that they can see, they can interact with, they can ask people about, and they can observe. But archaeology is harder to do because we can't go back in time. We can't go back to look at these cultures while there were active people. We can't ask them questions unless, of course, it's a contemporary archaeology, but that's not very common. And when does archaeology start? I mentioned in the introductory lesson before that there's such a thing as historical archaeology. So when does history end? Well, what's the history of yesterday? You could write a history of yesterday based on historical documents. You could also do an archaeology of yesterday. You could pick up all the stuff that fell out of your pockets when you came home and things dropped out onto your floor, and you could track them. You could understand, all right, what did this person, me, have in their pocket when they came in? When did this date to? When did this happen? What was the sequence of events that took place? And what does that tell me about the person and the culture that they lived in? Now that sounds kind of hard. That seems almost impenetrable, and at times it can be. The way that I try to understand it, or explain it, is that archaeology is like creating a mosaic, right? That you take little pieces and you put this piece fits here, and this piece fits here, and this piece fits here. Once you have enough pieces, you can sort of squint your eyes and you can get an idea of what the picture looked like. Is it perfect? No. Is it pixelated? Yes. If you get more and finer grained information, does your view and image of what that picture looked like in the past get better? Yes. But you also have to know where and how to frame these things and how to put it there. So it's not just the data find their own way. You've got to say, all right, I'm going to put this piece here because I think it fits there. But how do you know that? That's where theories and frameworks for understanding come in. And so archaeology, in that sense, is a science like many other. But it's also a social science because we have to understand the way humans work as systems. So we're going to talk a little bit in this first chapter about the methodologies for how archaeologists do the data collection, how you get that little mosaic piece to put into your picture. How do you record it? How do you understand it? And then in the following chapter 2, we're going to talk about the framework, the ideas, and how you take a tiny piece of data that you can put into this picture. But how do you know it goes there and not over here? That's where your theories and your theoretical frameworks come in. And we're going to look at the history of ideas and how we're constantly developing these things. The good news is, however, 100 years from now, people are going to look at Andrew McCarthy's excavations and they're going to say his theories were terrible. We disagree 100% with the conclusions that he drew, and all of his writings and books and publications you can throw away because he didn't know what he was talking about. I'm okay with that because our ideas always get better. I hope they'll be kinder to me than I just was to myself. But ideas improve through time. But hopefully what they will say in 100 years' time is, we don't accept his ideas anymore, but his data. Thankfully, he recorded his data well. And so that data can still be used to create new ideas and a new picture, because this piece that he put here actually should be over here. He didn't know that because he had a different framework and a different set of ideas. And so we actually jumble these things around. That's the picture that we're going for. So data collection has to be done in a scientific way. But the interpretation of those data is something that we will be constantly adapting. We're constantly going to be improving. And that's where the social science comes in. So archaeology is both a hard science where you collect physical raw data from the past. And it's also a social science because we have to understand how this fits into our understanding of the humans that were leaving these traces. Right. Now, this introduction, the preface to Chapter 1, talks a little bit about how archaeology is done in this in a modern day. Now, you may think of archaeology as this swashbuckling hero that you see in the films, or you may think of it as a geeky, spectacled book dweller. It's both and neither at the same time. There is academic research archaeology that drives people to and compels people to study particular times and places that they're most interested in. And I welcome that. I do that a lot myself. But there's also something, and I think you should be aware of this as archaeology students right now, that there is an industry, and there's actually a lot of jobs in archaeology. You may not realize it. But any development that takes place, any road construction, any infrastructure, any wind farms, any pipelines, any basement that you build in your house, any pool that you dig up to put in your backyard, requires permits from some sort of governing body. And you need planning permission, and you need a permit, and you need authorization to do that. Now, we all understand that if you want to put wiring in your house, you need to get a licensed electrician who will do it, and it will be inspected by someone from the government who will say, yes, this is to code. The same thing goes for before you ever start a project, digging in the ground. You need to make sure that you're not destroying archaeology. There are laws that protect archaeological resources in America and many other countries, and it is required by any developers to pay for licensed archaeologists to complete the work to make sure that there is nothing important being harmed. So this is something that's overlooked by most people, because most people, when they see a construction project, they see it after the foundations have been built, after all of the archaeologists have done their work and gone on, right? If you see a building going up on Las Vegas Boulevard, you only see it once it's starting to get above the ground. But what happened before that is an archaeologist has come in and said, yes, there is archaeology and it needs to be dealt with, or no, there is no archaeology that is important enough for us to be to have to mitigate. And this is an entire industry called cultural resource management, or CRM. And CRM companies employ a lot of archaeologists, not all of which who have PhDs like me. Some of them just have bachelor's degrees and experience. So this is something that I think it's important for everyone who studies archaeology to know, that this is actually a pretty rich field that you can get employed in, and happily. The difference between being a research archaeologist and being a CRM archaeologist is that the research archaeologist gets to choose what they want to study. There are fewer jobs for that, because who lets you get to do whatever it is that you like to do? Not many jobs. But the opposite of that trend is cultural resource management, where you have to deal with whatever comes up. Now, that's also kind of fun, because you become the master, the expert for an area, from the earliest prehistory to the latest things. When I started working in CRM here in Nevada, I wasn't particularly interested in historic archaeology of this area. But when you come across a cowboy campsite from 1914, and it's treated like archaeology, and you can find information on where people were sitting and what cigarettes they were rolling and what cans of beans they were opening and what kind of whiskey they were drinking. That's really kind of interesting stuff, and it tells a story about the people from the past. One that I wasn't really interested in, but one that I got drawn into. So CRM, people may be dealing with the first human inhabitants to come across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America one day, and then looking at Basque shepherds the next day. That's just something that in the preface I wanted to highlight because I think it's important to know that there are jobs in archaeology, and it's not all what the media, popular media, tells us archaeology is. It's at times tedious, it's at times exciting, but it's always contributing to our understanding of our past. Another thing in this preface is that once it's gone forever. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the thing that separates an archaeologist from a looter or a vandal is that we record what we are doing as we destroy it, but it is destructive. I actually don't like the word destructive for this archaeological process. I call it deconstruction. What you're doing is taking it apart to try and understand it better. If you look at a radio, a transistor radio or something, and you want to understand how it works, if you just walk around it and you start looking at it, you're probably not going to understand how a transistor works unless you open it up. You start to take the parts apart, see how they interact. That's how you can understand how it works. And then you might be able to rebuild it and reconstruct it and understand it better in the future. So archaeology is destructive by its nature, but by documenting what we're taking apart, it becomes deconstruction. And that's what looters and vandals don't do. They just destroy to take stuff. They don't replace what they've taken with a documentary record. So there are best practices for how to do this. How do archaeologists document what they're destroying in a way that can be useful 100 years from now, even though our ideas about what that information has changed? So your book gets into some subjects, and the learning objectives for this chapter are that you should understand by the end of this chapter what the goals of archaeological surveys are, the methods of horizontal and vertical excavation, the use of quantification in artifact and ecofact analysis, and the ways comparison and analogy are used in archaeology. Now, I'll just stop here for just a second and say that each one of these chapters is going to have some learning objectives. I've got some slides that are available on Canvas that you can follow along in my lecture, because that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to be going through each of these slideshows, talking to them, explaining them a little bit more fully, and that will help you to get through the chapter piece by piece. So these learning objectives are the key things that I want you to make sure that you know about, because chances are they're going to be on some sort of test. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'll take a break right here before we start getting into each of these learning objectives, and we'll resume in the next lecture, which will also be on Chapter 1. So I'll catch you in just a few minutes.